Von der Leyen arrived the way she always did, composed, deliberate, flanked by staff. She carried her talking points and her armor of institutional confidence. Nothing in her posture suggested she had any idea that the room she was walking into had already decided her fate before she sat down. The session opened on schedule, standard procedural formalities, agenda confirmed, cameras rolling. And then, without any theatrical buildup, the first blow landed. It came from a German MEP, a man from her own political bloc, someone whose job, at least in theory, was to stand beside her, not against her. He rose to speak, and the entire chamber registered the shift immediately. This wasn't going to be a polite critique wrapped in diplomatic language. This was a reckoning. He said he could no longer stay silent while the Commission drove European credibility into the ground. He said the Union had become an embarrassment on the international stage. He said ordinary citizens were being squeezed by policies designed in boardrooms while their leaders congratulated each other at summits that produced nothing but photo opportunities. And then he said it plainly, without hesitation, without apology. Von der Leyen must go immediately. For the sake of Europe itself, half the chamber erupted. The applause wasn't polite. It was the kind of release that follows a long, suffocating silence. The other half sat frozen. Von der Leyen's hands gripped the desk in front of her. The cameras caught every detail, the slight drain of color from her face, the micro-expression of someone who suddenly understands they are no longer in control of what happens next. But the German was just the opening act. A French representative took the floor moments later. Her tone was different, colder, more surgical. She laid out in clinical terms exactly how the Commission's handling of transatlantic relations had incinerated decades of diplomatic investment. The American administration wasn't even pretending to engage with Brussels anymore. Alliances that had formed the backbone of European security since 1945 were fraying not because of external pressure, but because of catastrophic mismanagement from within. She named names. She cited specific failures. She looked directly at von der Leyen while she did it. Then an Italian MEP rose, not waiting for permission, not managing his volume, just speaking, because at that point the room had entered a different register entirely. He talked about factories shutting down, about workers in his country losing jobs to a regulatory environment built by people who had never once had to make payroll or face a supplier they couldn't pay. He said Brussels had become a machine that produces paperwork and export suffering, and that the human cost of that machine was being borne by families who had no lobby, no access, and no recourse. The chamber didn't quiet between speeches anymore. It accumulated. Every new voice added another layer of pressure. Representatives from Poland, Hungary, Austria, the Netherlands, and Spain followed in rapid succession. The language escalated with each turn. Corruption was mentioned. Financial mismanagement was documented. Authoritarian tendencies were laid bare in front of running cameras and a global audience. Von der Leyen attempted to speak. She raised her hand. She was initially ignored, which was itself a statement. When she finally reached the microphone, something happened that the EU had never televised before. Elected representatives, adults, professionals, democratically chosen officials began openly jeering at her. Not polite heckling, actual, undisguised mockery. She tried to cite trade deals. The room almost laughed. She pivoted to climate policy. The mockery grew louder. Her voice cracked. The microphone recorded every tremor. The visual of it, a commission president visibly deteriorating at her own podium while colleagues laughed, hit the internet within 4 minutes. By the time the session hit its first recess, the clip had already cleared 50 million views across platforms. 12 nations simultaneously showed the same hashtag trending at #1. And while she stood at that podium trying to hold herself together, the streets outside were already moving. By midday, the area surrounding the Berlaymont building looked like something between a vigil and a siege. The crowd hadn't been bussed in or organized by political operatives. These were people who had followed the morning's events on their phones and decided that watching wasn't enough. Teachers, factory workers, Small business owners who had spent years submitting to regulations they had no hand in writing and no power to challenge. Students facing a landscape with fewer opportunities than their parents had at the same age. They didn't all carry the same signs or shout the same slogans, but they carried the same rage, the accumulated, compressed fury of people who had been told for years that the system was working, even as the evidence of their own lives contradicted that story every single day. The number reached 50,000 in Brussels before the afternoon session even resumed. In Berlin, protesters gathered outside the Chancellery, demanding that Olaf Scholz publicly separate himself from von der Leyen before her collapse became his. His approval ratings were already in crisis territory, and the political mathematics of association with a leader in freefall were devastating. His advisors reportedly spent the afternoon in emergency sessions calculating the least damaging available exit. In Paris, major intersections were blocked as demonstrators brought the city center to a standstill. Macron, whose own political survival was already a daily exercise in improvisation, faced mounting internal pressure to draw a clear line between the lists and Brussels. The French political class had learned from painful experience that being caught on the wrong side of popular anger carried consequences that no amount of clever messaging could undo. In Rome, the situation turned violent. Tear gas, thrown objects, shattered windows, fires in the street. The Italian government watched the images coming in from the capital and sensed an opportunity to reclaim policy ground it had been ceding to Brussels for years. The window might not stay open long. They intended to use it. The financial markets were registering everything in real time. The euro dropped to its lowest point in 5 years against the dollar. That's not a rounding error. That's hundreds of billions in wiped value within a single session. Major investment funds began liquidating European asset positions at a pace that triggered emergency warnings from 3 separate financial institutions. The language coming out of analyst desks shifted from cautious to alarmed within hours. The corporate world followed. Volkswagen announced emergency cost restructuring that put tens of thousands of jobs in scope. BMW suspended future European investment commitments entirely. Siemens released a statement questioning whether the continent's political trajectory was compatible with large-scale industrial operations. These weren't negotiating positions floated to extract concessions. These were cold-eyed survival calculations made by organizations with no interest in drama and every interest in predictability. The German industrial engine, already hemorrhaging from energy cost shocks and the collapse of American trade goodwill, was being pushed toward a threshold it could not recover from once crossed. The military dimension was quieter, but no less serious. Defense analysts speaking on background described a security picture that they had not seen since the immediate post-Cold War era. NATO's operational cohesion was degraded. European military spending was years behind any realistic deterrence standard. The diplomatic infrastructure that had historically compensated for those gaps was in ruins. Russia was watching. China was watching. Every actor with a strategic interest in European weakness was watching, with patience and with intent. And then came the document that changed everything. A Dutch MEP stood up with a folder of material obtained through months of legal pressure and freedom of information procedures. What he laid out in the chamber was an allegation of financial mismanagement that dwarfed every previous EU controversy in scale and specificity. Over 200 million euros in commission contracts, he alleged, had been routed to external consulting firms with connections to political operatives who had benefited from commission policy decisions. The contracts were deliberately written to obscure accountability. The deliverables were constructed to resist scrutiny. The money had moved, and the oversight mechanisms designed to catch exactly this kind of arrangement had been navigated around with apparent precision. The chamber went completely silent, not because the allegations were comfortable, but because not a single person seated in that room stood up to challenge them. Von der Leyen's most reliable defenders sat still. The silence was its own verdict. She left through a side exit, security forming a wall around her. Cameras followed as far as they could. Journalists shouted questions into the moving cluster of bodies. She said nothing. Her face had gone past the point of expression. This was not a tactical retreat. This was someone who knew the reckoning had already happened, and the paperwork was just catching up. By evening, 8 member states had formally called for an emergency summit to consider a no-confidence vote. The European project, that vast, complicated, flawed, hopeful construction of shared governance, was facing the kind of test it had never been designed to survive. The protests didn't stop at night. They evolved. In Brussels, impromptu stages appeared, and the language shifted from calling for one resignation to demanding structural accountability. In Warsaw and Budapest, decades of sovereignty grievances fused with fresh anger into something new and harder to contain. In Athens and Madrid, the economic wounds that had never fully healed were torn open again with renewed force. 72 hours. That was the window that analysts, diplomats, and strategists were all watching. Not because it was an arbitrary deadline, but because the half-life of a political crisis of this magnitude was measured in hours, not days. Either the center would move fast enough to absorb the shock, or the shock would define the center. The cameras were still rolling. The verdict was still being written. And the Europe that would exist on the other side of this moment would not look like the one that had existed before 10:15 that morning.